Hi everyone, it's James here. How are you all doing? Welcome to another video. So today I'm going to be looking at 10 sophomore albums, that's 10 second albums by 10 different artists, and I've seen this done before. People have done threads on this before. In fact, I think I've contributed to those threads, so I thought I'd find a new angle on it. So what I'm going to do, I've come up with 10 different categories of how an artist may approach the task of doing a second album. So let's just whiz through these. It won't take too long. So the first category that I've come up with is I'm going to call it the do that again approach. So the do that again approach means you do a first album which is really good, really well received, so you simply decide to repeat, do it again, maybe do it slightly better. That's incredibly subjective, but essentially just do it again. And the example that I'll give is Steely Dan, Countdown to Ecstasy, their second record, which I'd say is easily as good as the first one. Some people might disagree, but they didn't do anything different, particularly on the second one. They did just more of the same, and it was good. So the second approach is the opposite, and it's the do the opposite. So the one that I've got for this is McCartney and Ram. So McCartney's first album was mostly recorded at home. There were some segments that were recorded at Morgan Studios in London, but essentially it was done on a shoestring. McCartney plugged the microphone directly into the multi-track recorder and just basically recorded a series of snippets. There were a couple of songs, but it was mainly just little sketches. For Ram, complete contrast. He went to New York, he auditioned various great musicians and American session musicians, and he basically went to town and did a very big, kind of lush, occasionally orchestral, really complex album with lots and lots of vocal harmonies and kind of lots of whiz-bang production, some real big production numbers on this, including Monkberry Moon Delight and the absolutely epic Backseat of My Car at the end of the record, which is like an incredible Beach Boys homage, really. So yeah, pretty much the complete opposite of the first album. So that is the do the opposite. Right, now the third category is, not sure if I have a name for it. This is essentially the completely start again, the reboot sophomore album, where you're known for doing one thing. The first album allows you to do that thing, and then you just decide to completely change what you do, totally. And the example I've got for that is the Moody Blues and Days of Future Past. So the Moody Blues originally were a blues band. They were called the M&B 5 originally because they got sponsorship from the Mitchell and Butler Brewery in Birmingham, and they were one of those kind of earthy, bluesy bands, like Manfred Mann and the Animals, and then you had the Moody Blues. But essentially their career sputtered out quite soon, and they decided to regroup. A slightly new lineup. Denny Laine left, but they decided to. What happened was they were asked to do a test recording for some equipment in a studio somewhere, and they were asked to do a classical version of Dvorak's New World Symphony, and they did that. But then they also went on to record their own magnificent symphonic pop album, which had Nights in White Satin on it, and that basically launched them in a completely new direction, doing orchestral, symphonic art pop. And then they kind of went and took a slight left turn then and went into more of a kind of art rock, progressive rock style. But yeah, certainly between the first and second albums, a complete sea change. Right, so the next category is the sophomore album, where you basically do what you were not allowed to do or what you didn't get a chance to do on the first album because of situations beyond your control. So you make a first album, and it's not exactly the album that you wanted to make because outside circumstances kind of impinged on you. Then for the second album, you basically do the album that you really probably should have done for your first album. And the example I'm going to give for that is Trespass by Genesis. So Genesis were discovered by Jonathan King, who was a graduate of the public school which they all attended, and he discovered them, and he wanted them to be a more kind of Bee Gees pop style band. I think they had recorded some songs in that style, but obviously it was not going to be the style that they were going to be well known for. So Jonathan King, I think, supervised that first album from Genesis to Revelation, and then after that they kind of freed themselves from his control and went on to record their second album, Trespass, which laid the groundwork for their future career, obviously as a kind of art rock prog band, I guess. So yeah, this is the do what you actually wanted to do category of sophomore album. Right, so next we have, I do have a name for this one, already made. This is the Blind Alley sophomore album. So this is where a band do a first album, which is perfectly decent, and they're destined to go on in their future career to make albums very similar to that first album, but for some reason they take a little detour for the second album. It turns out to be a blind alley, and they quickly withdraw from that and get back on track again. So for this we're going to go for Time and a Word by Yes. So the first album did lay the groundwork for them just being a extremely complex and virtuosic progressive rock group, and then for some reason, I can't remember how it came to be, but they decided to go down the orchestral route for the second album. This was the late 60s, early 70s when lots of bands were doing that. They decided to go for a symphonic approach and use strings. Didn't go down well with everybody in the band, and there were a few ruptions happened. I think was it Peter Banks who left the band shortly afterwards. Not everybody was happy. In fact, most people in the band were not happy with this direction. And after this album, they completely ditched the strings and went back to doing the kind of music that they'd done on the first album. So that was the Dead End Sophomore. Right, so this next one, let me get my thinking cap on. Right, so this one is the enforced lineup change, followed by a bit of floundering around. Sophomore album. And this is where a band makes a first record and then a key member leaves the group. And as a result of that, the band are kind of plunged into a bit of a crisis, but they try and soldier on. But the second album obviously does not have that creative linchpin involved, so the band do slightly struggle to find a direction. So the example I'm going to give is Saucer Full of Secrets by Pink Floyd. Now Syd Barrett is on this record. He's meant to play some slide guitar on a couple of tracks, and of course he has a song at the end of the record, Jug Band Blues. But in general this record does not really contain his writing. You've got songs by Roger Waters and Richard Wright, and you've got a couple of, you've got one big group composition, A Saucer Full of Secrets. So, the first Pink Floyd album is often held up as being a bit of a psychedelic masterpiece because it has lots of great little, concise, very characterful Syd Barrett songs on it, whereas the second album, even though it's a good record, there is a slight feeling, I guess, of a band trying to feel its way. They're trying to imitate Syd's songs. Rick Wright does a couple of tracks, Remember a Day and Seesaw, which are clearly trying to imitate Syd a little bit. And David Gilmour has not really found his way as a guitar player yet. He's trying to imitate Syd Barrett to an extent, doing the kind of floaty, psychedelic guitar textures which Syd had done. So, but they're not quite finding their voice yet, and it's going to take at least another 2 or 3 albums before that happens. Right, so the next category is the Lay It On Thicker sophomore album. So it's sort of like the first category, the Do It Again category, but it's a bit different because you don't do it exactly the same. You do it exactly the same, but you lay it on thicker. So everything that you did on your first album, you do it again, but you magnify it. And you make it bigger, you make it bolder, you make it more complicated. Everything that was characterful about your debut, you do it again, but in a much more amplified style. And for that we'll go with Queen 2. So Queen's sound was really well formed right at the outset. They sounded like themselves. The first album though did have a couple of derivative elements. You could hear elements of Led Zeppelin, you could hear elements of Hendrix and Yes actually. The songs were already complex, containing lots of vocal harmonies and stacked guitars, but for Queen 2 they decided to really go for broke, take the template which they'd done on the first album and just ramp everything up. So the tracks got longer, the arrangements got even more complicated, and they clearly decided to go for broke. The first album was recorded after hours at Trident Studios because the band didn't really have a big recording budget. For Queen 2 they had a much bigger budget and they were able to go in and do it bigger, do it better, and lay it on thicker. Right, so we've got 3 more to go. So this category, I'm going to call it the Pull Your Socks Up sophomore album. This is where an artist does a first album, which is quite possibly really good, but the second album they really pull their socks up and they decide to properly take themselves in hand and go, okay, that first album was okay, but we need to do one now, or I need to do one now that really nails it. I didn't really nail it on my first album, I need to properly nail it on my second album and show what I can do, taking what was good about the first album but doing it better and doing it more focused. For that we'll go for Elvis Costello and this year's model, where he was joined by the Attractions for the first time. The first album he'd recorded with members of Clover, the American R&B band, and even though the songs are really good and Elvis's attitude is kind of there, but the musical backing is quite laid back. It doesn't exactly go with the personality that Elvis was trying to cultivate. Jake Riviera, his manager, put the Attractions together. They were a totally different concept. They were a hard driving kind of bar band with a lot of aggression and kind of new wave, even punk frenzy, and they enabled Elvis to really drive home his musical vision for the second album, enabled him to pull his socks up and do something truly representative. Right, two lefts. So this next one, I could have picked a really famous example, but I went for a really obscure example instead. So this is the Sweeten the Pill sophomore album. So this is where an artist makes a first album, which again is good, bad, indifferent, whatever. But the first album is not very commercial. It's kind of, maybe it's quite raw. It's not particularly polished. It doesn't have a great deal of mainstream appeal. And then the band decides for the second album, or the artist, for the second album, they decide to sweeten the pill. They try to give the music more of a commercial edge. They don't necessarily, row back on what they do best, but they do try and sweeten it. And for that, we'll go with the Motors, Approved by the Motors, which was their second album. So the Motors were a pub rock band, really, in the mid-70s, who hitched a ride on the new wave movement. Their first album was really raw. It was produced by Robert Mutt Lange, and it had a kind of Stooges sound to it, a pub rock sound but ramped up, quite influenced by punk, really hard driving twin guitars, and it was a sort of heavy rock album really. John Peel loved it. I think it was his favourite album of 1977. And then what the Motors did, they kind of decided to just sweeten the pill. They recorded a song called Airport, which is on this record, which is completely dominated by this very, very commercial and slightly cheesy sounding keyboard part, a synth part, electric piano, and it was much more jaunty, it was much more chart orientated, and the rest of this album, even though it does have some rocking stuff on it, it's definitely more commercial. You've got the song Forget About You, which accidentally borrowed the theme from a popular TV sports show here in the UK, Grandstand, and there's a lush ballad at the end of the side 2 called Today, and just in general it's a sweeter proposition. It's definitely more commercial, definitely trying to aim more for the pop charts, and it worked for them. They had a huge hit with Airport. That was a number 2 hit in 1978, so there we go. And the third album was even more, well, I say commercial, it completely bombed, but they tried to go even more down that kind of big pop hook chorus type route. Okay, so the final, number 10. This category is the team up with a famous producer sophomore album. So this is where the artist has made an album and then they decide for the second album that they're going to team up with somebody with a great reputation, somebody who's going to translate what they do, turn it into something bigger, better, bolder. Now there's loads of examples of this. This is one of the most populous categories. I think I'm sure you'll be able to think of some for this. I've gone for a really obvious one. I'm going to go for Lou Reed, which, and this is Transformer, of course. So the first Lou Reed album is a good album. It's okay, but it's definitely, it undersells his vision really. It's got a bit of a, it's quite earthy. It's not particularly innovative, I guess. And David Bowie had been a massive fan of the Velvet Underground. He wanted to take Lou Reed in hand basically and make something really special. So he and Mick Ronson got together and they just crafted this absolutely legendary album for Lou Reed, which is still probably his best work. It has Perfect Day on it, it has Satellites of Love, Walk on the Wild Side. It was such a big production number. And that tends to be what happens when when bands team up with a big producer. the reason they do it is because they want to draw on that producer's expertise and vision and allow themselves to be transmuted into something else, if you will. So there we go, that wraps up the video. 10 different categories of Sophomore Album. I'll be interested to hear if you can think of any examples of your own, if the mood takes you. Alright folks, I will see you soon. Take care. Bye bye.